Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Alicia Powell-Gillis, and I am the Senior Editor at Route 50. It is my great pleasure to welcome you to today's webcast, Continuing the Mission, State and Local Resiliency Strategies for the Future, underwritten by Amazon Web Services. As in almost every industry and discipline, the COVID-19 pandemic hit state and local governments hard. To minimize disruption and continue delivering essential services to citizens, agencies needed resiliency strategies. But how can state and local governments develop long-term resilience, and what technologies and tools will they need to do that? And what takeaways from past disasters can be applied to prevent disruptions in the face of future adversities? We'll discuss these questions and so much more throughout the next hour. Before we get started, a quick note for our audience. If you'd like to ask the panelists a question, just please make sure to submit them at any point throughout the program by entering it into the Q&A box. We have left time towards the end of the program for a more dedicated Q&A session. However, I strongly encourage you to submit your questions along the way so we can get right to them when the time comes. Now, let me bring in the panelists who will be exploring this topic with me today. First up, Genesis Gavino, Resilience Officer of the City of Dallas. Harold Dominguez, City Manager of the City of Longmont, Colorado. Patrick Howell, Program Manager for Community Resilience at the Institute for Building Technology and Safety. And Crystal Reyes, Chief Resilience Officer of the City of Tulsa. Thank all of you for joining me today. So before we get into the meat of this conversation, I'm just going to go around the horn really quickly and ask each of you to briefly introduce yourself and give us a sense of your role, expertise in the resilience space. So Genesis, I'm going to start with you.
Thank you, Alicia. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us for such a critical conversation. Like Alicia said, my name is Genesis Gavino, and I currently serve as the Resilience Officer for the City of Dallas. I'm embedded within the Office of Equity and Inclusion at the city, and essentially my role is to implement the Resilient Dallas strategy, which we have had in place since 2018, following our participation in the 100 Resilient Cities Challenge or program through the Rockefeller Foundation.
Excellent. Harold. Harold, you're on mute.
Oh, it hit it again. All right, sorry. There we go. Obviously, serving as a city manager and working with the organization and looking at resiliency, it's looking internal to our organization and making sure that we can respond to anything that comes our way. But at the same time, bridging into the community and focusing on that larger community resiliency. And I'll talk a little bit about how we've evolved based on the flood we had here a few years ago.
Excellent. Crystal.
Hi, everyone. I'm Crystal Reyes. I'm the City of Tulsa's Chief Resilience Officer, and similar to Genesis, my office, the Mayor's Office of Resilience and Equity, is charged with implementing our resilience strategy, which also was launched in 2018. And that strategy focuses on 4 areas, building social cohesion, addressing barriers that are experienced by those that are most vulnerable in our city, increasing economic opportunity and financial resilience for all Tulsans, and then also sort of the transformative work and internal work around practices, policies, and other systems that need to change to make the city more equitable. So thanks for having me.
Thanks, Crystal. And last but certainly not least, Patrick.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia, and good afternoon, everybody. It's nice to be with you all. Again, my name is Patrick Howell. I'm with the Institute for Building Technology and Safety, or IBTS. There, I lead our Community Resilience Initiative. So largely what that has entailed was the development and deployment of a resilience assessment framework and tools, something we call CRAFT. So part of that was developing a lot of the metrics that we then use to carry forward into communities to perform resilience assessments to really identify vulnerabilities and strengths. Most recently, this work has been most robust in Puerto Rico and elsewhere in the Caribbean, particularly after a devastating hurricane season in 2017, 2018. Again, it's great to be with you all. I'm looking forward to the conversation.
Excellent. So let's get to that conversation. And so my first question for all of you is just, I think we all think of the world, obviously, in terms of before COVID and after COVID. And so I'm kind of curious to hear, and I think a couple of you alluded to this, is just what were we seeing in terms of resiliency strategies prior to COVID-19? So Patrick, I'm going to start with you and then work my way backwards.
Yeah, I think what's really interesting about this, at least in the communities that I had engaged with and work with, we found that public health was often listed in a resilience strategy, but most oftentimes at a very minimum. So if there was a mandate to include contingencies for public health emergencies in their hazard mitigation plan, we found that that was there. But when it came time to actually make some plans, develop projects, prioritize those projects, public health was very rarely on that list. And so I think that that's certainly something that we're going to see moving forward in the future, is a greater focus on public health and pandemics, and then how that kind of cascades into these other resilience strategies and mitigation measures that we see throughout the country.
Thanks, Patrick. Harold, I'm going to turn to you because you mentioned obviously the floods that in kind of helped shape where you all were coming in terms of resiliency. So talk to us a little bit about what you all were doing in Longmont for resiliency and what strategy you had in place prior to the pandemic.
Yeah, this was an interesting question because when we looked at it, and so for a frame of reference, I arrived here in 2012. And so, Longmont's always been an entrepreneurial community. And so we didn't really have any formal resilience strategies at that point. We were really focusing on sustainability and continuity of operations. And then about a year and a half later, we had Colorado's largest natural disaster in the flood. And we were sort of, many would argue, at the epicenter. And coming out of that and through the recovery effort, we really started focusing on resiliency as a broader topic. And what Patrick was talking about is how do we focus on the resiliency of our infrastructure? How do we focus on economic resiliency and then resiliency within neighborhoods? Because all of those pieces are foundational in terms of the recovery. So we had some real-time experience in that. And so over the last 7 years, we've really been going through it. And I think where we've tried to focus on is, in order to really get the organization embedded in this, was really create a resilient culture within the organization and a mindset in all areas so that we stay focused on it. Because what we don't want to do is create processes and steps, but then as you get further away from a disaster, you lose focus on it. And so it's that resilient culture and mindset throughout the organization. And, obviously practice what would happen in a pandemic and how we would move through it. But really what we learned from the flood was we had a lot of our staff that were isolated. And so we started setting goals of how do you work from home? And fortunately, that helped us out.
Excellent. Crystal, turn to you to hear what you all had in place in Tulsa prior to the pandemic.
Sure. And, I'll just share, responding to Patrick's comment about public health. I think that's really, we see that too, in terms of having health be kind of embedded in all that we do. We actually had a strategy in our plan that was to embed like a health in all policies approach. And so we were just kind of starting that, thinking about how to make that happen with our local county health department. And so, prior to, I think this, our involvement in the Global Resilient Cities Network, which is the network that Genesis and our cities are a part of, I think the city of Tulsa didn't have this broader framework around resilience, as Harold was saying as well. Resilience is the ability to survive, adapt, and thrive through chronic stressors or acute shocks. That's the working definition that we all use. And that touches every aspect of life, the economic resilience, social connection, health. And I think public health has a really big role to play. They have a long history of talking about social determinants of health, which is all the components of where we live, work, and play that impact our ability to survive a shock and a stress like COVID. And so our plan actually is focused, it was launched in 2018, and we identified our toughest resilience challenge, and the main focus of our resilience work is on racial equity. And so I think that serves us well in terms of having that lens, as we then had to actually go through a few major stressors this year. We had a big flood in 2019, and then of course we had the pandemic this year.
Excellent. And Genesis, to you.
Yes, thank you. So I think, similar to what Crystal was speaking about, my office was working closely with the Dallas County Health and Human Services Department prior to the pandemic to align a lot of what we're doing here at the city with our community health needs assessment. We don't oversee the county health department, and so making sure that we are connected in various ways, if not through policy, then through programs and services. We're part of a cohort across the nation called Building Community Resilience, what that looks like, and really focusing on a people-centered approach, understanding that we can build green buildings as much as we can, and then we can make sustainable infrastructure, but if there are no people around to actually utilize them, then we've really missed the point, right? And much like Tulsa, we focused a lot on racial equity in our plan. Our first goal is advancing equity, and that's embedded across our 6 other goals of becoming a welcoming city, economic mobility, equitable transportation, healthy communities, neighborhood infrastructure, and environmental sustainability. So always looking at it from a lens of racial equity, understanding that different groups of people advance at different rates in our communities, and I'm sure you can say that in your community as well. And so if we can start from there, then we can better understand what are the services and programs and policies to make sure that everybody advances together.
So Genesis and Crystal, I want to stick on a point that you both have raised, obviously, and it did strike me as you two were telling me your roles, how equity is you're housed within equity offices. So can you talk a little bit more about really what that connection is? Why is resilience and equity, why are they so intertwined, and why is that important? So Genesis, I'll start with you, then let Crystal respond as well.
I think this goes back to a much larger conversation about understanding our history and how we got to where we are today, right? How inequities exist for us right now, and what role policy has played in creating the inequities, and how we can actually address those today and make it better for our people. And so, for us, resilience is, again, focusing on equity and inclusive practices. We look at it's not just looking at race, but also looking at people who can't speak, who don't speak English as their first language, right? Looking at immigrant and refugee populations here in Dallas. So if we go back to the racial equity in understanding how we have contributed to that, and then the reckoning with what we can do to move forward together.
Yeah, Genesis, you said almost everything I was going to share. So I'll just echo that and say, racial equity, we define, and it's defined across various groups, that race shouldn't determine your outcomes, and outcomes for everyone are improved when we have racial equity. And so that's what we're striving for in Tulsa, and I think what we're all striving for in our cities. And resilience is a wonderful framework. I think it's a way to organize people around this idea that if you build the systems in place and you address the challenges faced by the most vulnerable in our communities, you're going to build a system that's going to withstand these shocks. And so we are, part of a network of cities that is practicing this resilience framework. And a really big key component of it, there's several drivers of it, but one of those components is inclusive leadership, integrated leadership, as well as, participatory community engagement. And so when we involve communities in from the very beginning on establishing some of these policies or reforming them or creating programs, we'll get better results. So that's definitely part of our resilience framework.
Thank you both for answering that question. So just kind of to pull the thread along about, as I said earlier, we talk about things before COVID. I also want to talk about, after/during COVID, since we're not really after it, just in terms of resiliency. Yes, you're all been working, all of your jurisdictions, and all of you have been working on this topic for quite some time, but just kind of, but it's not there's no end goal, there's no end point. You always be striving for resiliency. So in terms of the pandemic itself, how were the resilience strategies and plans that you had? How do they work in the pandemic? How do they hold up well? And also, I'm going to kind of pull in a question that we did get from our audience member on this, is just, what was the most effective part of the resiliency strategy that you've encountered? And I'd like you to particularly talk about that in terms of COVID as well. So I'm going to start with Harold on this one.
Yeah, so I think generally we were pretty fortunate in that our strategies held up well throughout our COVID response. And I'm going to talk about it in two frameworks. The first being, I think we saw as a lot of communities really struggle to move to that fully online presence and how you work in the virtual world. And we had actually started doing that and based out of a flexible work environment request from our organization. And so we were able to flip the switch pretty quickly for those that needed to work from home. And also then flip the switch for our council to have remote meetings, which they still do. So from a technology perspective, really being the basis in the response, we've done well. I think on the other side, to the point that Genesis and Crystal were really talking about in terms of resiliency, it's about so many things. But at the end of the day, it's really foundational to the community. And the communities are judged by how well you take care of those that are most in need in your community. And I think what was rooted in how we've worked and how we're continuing to work with our communities and in our community involvement strategy that Longmont's had in place for over 15 years, and how we've engaged the communities in all the conversations we have. So as things were occurring, we were really able to bring multiple economic development partners together. Neighborhoods were communicating into our neighborhood services group. And so we were able to respond really quickly. So to the answer of what's the strategy, not a plan that works. It's really anchoring in on that community engagement process early on and having those conversations with your community on normal items. Because when you build the relationship in that community engagement strategy, it serves you beyond what you can even imagine, whether it's a natural disaster or in this case, a pandemic. And so I would say focus on community engagement with all sectors of your community. And utilize your cultural brokers. That's been a big asset for us throughout this process, is our engagement with our cultural brokers in our community.
Thanks, Harold. Patrick, from IBTS's standpoint, what do you think worked well in terms of resilient strategies during the pandemic? And you started talking about this in your opening remarks, but what do you think might change as a result? How might COVID change the approach to resilience in the future?
Mm-hmm. Right. Yeah. And I think first really want to build off of what Harold said. I think he really nailed it, that, you know, what works before the pandemic as well as during and after the pandemic are those relationships that you build with your community stakeholders. And so those may be individual stakeholders, you know, citizens that you build that relationship with, or it could be community groups or you know, any other type of advocacy group that is working towards the same goal as you. And so I think in the communities that I have worked with, that's certainly something that we saw kind of across the board, is the maintenance and even further development of those relationships, which was interesting to me because we then had all of the challenges to overcome with social distancing and having to do most of our engagement activities online, and found that, again, having had already built those relationships, it was much easier to transition into that remote and social distance type of engagement. I think one thing that did not necessarily stand up very well, and I'll speak from my experience in Puerto Rico, and this could be a somewhat unique context in that Puerto Rico is still very much in recovery mode after Hurricanes Maria, Hurricanes Irma in 2017. And so I think their focus was still trying to get their infrastructure back up, get their governance systems back into place, make sure that everybody had the economic resources recovered that they may have lost. And so they weren't, while they were looking towards the future in terms of a long-term recovery, I don't think that they were necessarily expecting a pandemic or a public health crisis, probably like most of us, right? So there was little to no kind of contingency plans for that, really. And so, again, as I said in my opening remarks, I think that's going to be a major pivot, at least in Puerto Rico, is to start to have a greater or a more wider view of the potential hazards and the potential threats to the communities.
Thanks, Patrick. And before I bring in Crystal and Genesis, Harold, we got a couple of questions from the audience. Can you please define what cultural brokers is? It's a great term.
Yeah, so how we defined it is and so in our community, we have a diverse population, and we have individuals within our diverse populations that interact with neighborhoods, different demographic groups, and they are working then with us. So it is the person who is the conduit into the different demographic groups and neighborhoods within your community so that you can get your messages out and ensure that they're getting there. I don't know if that answers it, but it's a conduit to different demographic groups.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So, Genesis, from your vantage point in Dallas, how were the resilience strategies that you had built up? How did they hold up during the pandemic? What did you think worked? What were you happy with? What did you think may have been missing?
Yeah, so, like I said, Dallas's strategy is very people-centered. We look at the person and how do we uplift our people, right? And so as we were in the planning stages of our response to the pandemic, our team was always asking who is left out, who is not at the table, who are we not considering, always making sure to have that question at the forefront, and then developing our responses that way. We did it in two ways. We focused on data, and then we also make sure, like Harold was saying, to leverage our relationships with the community. And I love your term, Harold. I've heard it in various settings of cultural brokers. They are the trusted leaders in communities that people will listen to and take advice from, right? So as government, we know we can't just walk into a community and expect people to accept things that we say at face value. And so working hand in hand with our cultural brokers, our community navigators is a term that we use here in Dallas, really helps advance, whatever messaging you're trying to get out into the community. And when you look at data, so what our team did early into the pandemic was develop an equity impact assessment tool, trying to help us, because, obviously everybody experienced this. There's a rush to get resources and trying to understand what parts of the city we need to focus our resources in. And so being able to pinpoint using data as the first step of, okay, we'll go here, but then checking with your cultural brokers and understanding, is this true? Does this, help us validate this or provide more context with the qualitative information? So, we've used our data to help support different task force like La Alianza that focuses on our Latinx population and how COVID is affecting them predominantly, as well as our African American communities. We have a La Alianza task force, and then we have a Black COVID task force that our equity and inclusion team provides support to in terms of like data and helping get out information. Also early on, our office launched the anti-stigma campaign for COVID. We've done PPE distribution. And so when you start from a place of focusing on people, there's no limit to what you can do there, and you really can uplift those who are being left out of the conversation.
Excellent. Crystal.
Yeah, I'll just echo a lot of what has been said, that the relationships that we had early on, we were able to transition to virtual and then get things started and launched. One example relates to our financial resilience. I think we launched our kickoff to develop a financial counseling program in Tulsa, which doesn't exist. And that would be providing free professional one-on-one counseling to any Tulsan who just needs some help planning so we can build financial resilience. And we had that group started before the pandemic. And then we just transitioned. And this group was 30 people meeting monthly to plan this event. And in the midst of that, we also launched a separate program to help those that are in immediate crisis, dealing with, food insecurity or not being able to pay their utilities. And so I think that was only possible. It's a great example. It's only possible when you have those relationships, as Harold said, that you have the trust and then you have the kind of shared mission to help create a program that can help people who are really in an immediate challenge because of this pandemic, the economic impacts of it, the social impacts, and the mental health impacts.
So, Krista, I want to stay with you because I know you use the term social connection, and I really want to, since I think probably the consensus you all brought up is the connection, partnerships, et cetera. And so I'm curious to hear, to have you talk a little bit more about how you built those to start. Like, who are these people? Who are the people you're making social connections with? Who do you think were the most effective? Who were maybe the ones that were harder to get, but you were able to kind of sway? Can you just give us a little bit more insight into how you built that and how you do plan to sustain it, not only just now in our era of social distancing, but beyond?
Yeah, so when I mention social connection, I'm talking both about that sort of metric we're all looking at in our cities around building social cohesion in communities. So one of our strategies in our Resilient Tulsa plan is to build a resilience hub. I think there's other cities that are trying to do this as well. And that just doesn't mean, okay, does everyone have an emergency plan? It's have we identified our community assets? Have we identified the trusted leaders? Are we using a positive framework, not a deficit framework, in how we're thinking about what communities need? And so those are the types of strategies that we need to be building more in Tulsa. We're piloting some of those right now. But so that's like social connection at the community level, and then making sure people feel, connected across the city as Tulsans. And we have some strategies related to that as well. Then on the connection with community partners, someone asked, what's a strategy? I would say in 3 words: participatory community engagement. And so we are trying to move our city towards that end of that community engagement. So moving just from outreach and reaching out and sending information to really planning with communities to address their most pressing needs.
Genesis, you have also talked about the social connection, and I'm also struck by the point you made just before about the use of data and to get the equity impact assessment. So from what I want to kind of hear from you, it's similar to what I asked Crystal about how are you making those social connections, but also when I think about communities, particularly communities who have been historically marginalized or disadvantaged, how do you get them to trust what you're doing? How do you get them on board to work with you and really be honest and forward with you about the issues that they're facing?
So I think it goes back to, it's a long process, right? You're not just going to walk into a room and immediately, or turn on a web conference and be able to say, okay, yes, I trust you with all this information, or that you can trust me. So it's a really long process of getting, showing that you as government are very intentional about inclusivity. And it's not about just taking their feedback and being able to put it in a report or a council presentation, say, hey, we talked to this community and they said this, but it's actually embedding it in the different practices and, programs, services that you are going to employ. And I think you can see that in what we're now calling our Resilience 2.0, looking at it as an addendum to our existing resilience plan, right? We got a lot of feedback, obviously, just like other jurisdictions, from the civil unrest and then also from the pandemic, of what works and what doesn't work for them and what the community needs. And I think, our Resilience 2.0 is the first step in showing the community that we're being responsive, adding programs for mental health support, really non-existent prior, to this, expanding supports for our youth and young adults, right? LGBTQ services. It's really, and people always say this, cities' priority is in their budget. And if you look at their budget, you can see where the money is going and who they're really trying to address in, how they are putting their money where their mouth is, I guess, so to say. And so when you look at our budget this year, it really reflects a lot of what the community has been asking us. Now, although a lot asks us to defund the police, that's not really happening, but showing more of those community services and programs and a focus on making sure that it's a holistic approach.
Great, and we'll come to budget in a second, but let me ask Harold and Patrick to also comment on the social connection and what they've been seeing from their vantage point. So Harold and then Patrick.
So in terms of the social connection, I think you have to be intentional about your connection to your community in everything you do. And I think a lot of times to what Genesis was saying, Genesis and Crystal are a lot of the same things. If it has to be fundamentally embedded in everything you do as an organization in that intentional community involvement process. And so whether it's you're looking to build a park or you're looking at a street construction project, we have built that into our community involvement process is embedded in everything we do. And so when you take that focus, it then becomes, and you're going to hear me say this a lot, what's the organizational culture around resiliency? And so you build it into your culture, into your daily operations, so that when you then come into these situations, it's at the forefront of our conversations. And so even in our EOC structure, we have an equity social broker person that sits there with us, and they listen to everything we're talking about, and they're pinging us to say, have you thought about this? Are you doing this? The evolution of that, and I'm going to riff a little bit to get into the economic side, is as we were working on our economic development strategies, we took that out into the community about 6 years ago and really used our community involvement process. It's now evolved to the point to where we're actually working on economic development out of a collective impact model, where everyone's coming together and trying to reach this other level to the point of you're as strong as the weakest part of your community, so you have to strengthen everything. And so now when we started dealing with businesses, I had a group that came together very quickly that was composed of our Latino chamber, our downtown groups, and that group was already used to working with each other in their daily operations. So it wasn't hard for us to spin, and I could go into that one group and hear what's happening in the entire community. But that was an intentional focus that we had, and that's part of that cultural piece of how do we work together as a community. Obviously, it's much easier. We're a community of about 100,000, so it's a different conversation versus a Dallas in terms of the size, but it's really about being intentional in your engagement with your community from the very beginning when you're not in a crisis.
Okay, Patrick?
Yeah, Genesis, Crystal, and Harold really covered all of the really great points. At this point, I'm kind of just going to echo what they said, but a couple of the highlights, from them is the having a people-centric approach, leading with social equity, and again, at risk of just copying what they said, of being very intentional, and then showing where your priorities really are through your budgets and then your actual actions.
Well, on that note, let's go ahead and talk about budgets, because obviously this is another top of mind issue for state and local governments who are facing what is looking in many communities to be some of their most dire financial situations since the recession. So I'm just kind of curious to hear from you all, is just how do you see this economic disruption affecting future resiliency investments? Is it going to help make the case for them? Is it going to hurt the case? What are you seeing? So, Genesis, let me start with you since you brought up budget to begin with.
Thank you. So obviously everybody's going to be doing a bunch of belt tightening and, crunching of some numbers. But the way I see that resiliency is going to be embedded in our future budgets is we're no longer going to look at funding projects that only address one issue, right? So they have to be cross-cutting, and then being able to bring in external partners. And I want to use the example right now of the big project that I'm working on is bridging the digital divide, right? So what does that look like for us? It's not just a matter of purchasing Wi-Fi hotspots to distribute across the city, but it's also working with our private sector, our nonprofits, and then our also education sector of how can we leverage our current infrastructure to support and expand so that we can provide coverage in sectors of the city that historically have not had coverage, right? So right now, the school district, Dallas Independent School District, and the city are working closely on several projects together where we're actually going to leverage our libraries and schools in specific hot zones or deserts that we have right now. looking at how do we combine, the relief funding that we have right now, funding that the school district has, so that we can expand coverage of, Wi-Fi signal or internet connectivity into the homes that are surrounding these schools. And so that we know that, these areas lack connectivity. And so if they're not getting connection through like a Wi-Fi, can we do a hard, connection through fiber in the ground to a tower? So these are just different ways that we're looking at our budget, moving forward. Is we don't have a lot of money, right? So sales tax is going down, what's coming in is not as much as we had projected. Pandemic is hitting every sector in the city. So how then can we partner with external entities? One last example, and then I'll stop and let everybody else speak. We know that the immigrant and refugee populations were left out of federal relief funding. So we immediately, mobilized and reached out to a lot of our partners across the nation. How can we support them? And philanthropy stepped up. Seeding, we have right now what we call the Mls Resilience Fund, cash in hand for our immigrant and refugee communities that that can't apply for a lot of the programs that we have out there right now. And so that using that as seed money to then get other, local philanthropy to buy into, this is something that we should invest in, and using it as a, case, a demonstration that if we can invest in all of our people, then we can all advance.
Thanks, Genesis. And just a reminder to our audience to please go ahead and submit your questions as we're getting close to the Q&A time. Harold, from your vantage point, how will the economic situation affect resiliency investments in long?
So I think it's another great question, because from an economic perspective, you actually have two issues most cities have two issues that we're dealing with. The first issue is the immediate budget impact that we're dealing with this year. We're all then also planning for the budget for next year, and we're on a calendar year budget cycle. So we had to reconcile those two issues. But similar to what Genesis said, I think what this has done is really focused us in on what we need to do for our community, and looking at those things that have a much larger impact versus just something that's very specific to one particular point. And so as we were going through our budget process, that was a lot of, in my budget meetings when I was reviewing it, that was a lot of our conversation about, what is the broader impact to the community? How is this helping us deal with flood recovery, because we're still finishing that up within the pandemic? And then how are we working to position our community to spin out of this when everything starts, hopefully in the future, go, turning back, while we have lower revenues. We're actually not in a bad position compared to other cities around us. And so it really was just focusing on it. But I think that what it's going to change in future budget years is really being focused on what that broader impact is, and how do we, again, position the entire community to be successful from the front end, because unlike some of the larger cities, we didn't get CARES dollars early on. So we were having to mobilize our budgets to try to get some dollars out into the community before the CARES funding came through. And so that's going to be a big focus of ours in future budget years, is really when we look at doing things, what's the broader impact of the community? But then on the other side, if I can take a quick minute to Genesis' point on the digital divide, that really raised its head with schools not in session in our community. But we were fortunate because we have our own electric utility, but we also have our own broadband utility, which we provide fiber to the home. So what it allowed us to do was very quickly in that utility spin it, and they started creating special programs for people that didn't have internet access in our community, to the point where we gave like 2 to 3 free months. We had reduced rates. So we really started digging into our utilities to go, how can we make a difference in someone's life immediately, especially on the digital divide, through one of our enterprise funds. And so we were able to very quickly get a large number of kids connected to the internet. Then we realized, well, some of them stay with their grandparents because their parents have to work. So then we expanded their program to their grandparents. And then we realized, well, we have a digital divide in our senior population. So we were just expanding it, but moving very quickly in that enterprise fund because we knew that was something we could do to impact the community immediately.
Great. And Crystal.
Yeah, I'll just add one point around data and why that's going to be really important going forward and using an equity lens for our data. The city of Tulsa is funded through sales tax and use tax. Property taxes aren't allowed to fund city services. So we are the traditional city services that are funded: the streets, the roads, sewer, the trash. And so, coming from, I originally from New York City, I moved to Tulsa. So it was very different. Where's the people budget? I was asking when I got here. But government, even if we don't have those funds, has a role to play. And so we are using our office, the fact that we have a resilience strategy, the fact that we release an annual report on 54 indicators across the city that measure inequality across a range of metrics. So going forward, that data and data that we're collecting now or going to be collecting around the impact of COVID on our communities will be very important because we want to make decisions that will help those that are experiencing the most challenges because, with limited dollars, we're going to have to make some hard choices. So using data with an equity lens, I think, is going to be very key for a lot of cities going forward.
Yeah, and Patrick, just to round this out on this topic, curious from your experience in PR in Puerto Rico and what you're seeing now is just, as Crystal just alluded to, there will be some hard choices. So what do you think are going to be some effective investments in resiliency that states and cities and counties should look at?
Yeah, I think limited resources and tight budgets is no stranger to those that make budgets in Puerto Rico. And so I think they are somewhat accustomed to doing the most that they can already with these limited resources. And one of those things, and Genesis really touched on this, Harold, as well, where we're building those co-benefits. How can we leverage certain projects, certain programs, certain funds to amplify the potential impact? And looking at those cross-sectoral opportunities to really enhance that community level resilience. And I think that's one thing that Puerto Rico and the mayors and leadership in Puerto Rican municipalities have done a really fantastic job at, both before and after some of these major events.
Great, thank you all. So I'm going to turn to a couple of audience questions. The first one I'm going to bring up is related to our conversation around community connection. So what platforms have you been using to reach out to communities during the pandemic? So Genesis, Crystal, or Harold, I think that's for any one of you to kind of chime in on that.
I'll start off real quick and then pass it off to the next person. I think, I want to use the digital divide example. A lot of what we've been doing, not just the city, but everyone else is virtual, right? But when you think about who is not connected in your cities, in your jurisdictions, it's a lot bigger than you would think. And so you have to go back to your basics, right? Working with newspapers. We have a lot of ethnic newspapers here in the city of Dallas. We leverage them to get information out, not just for our rent and mortgage assistance programs and letting people know that that's available, but also connecting them to the city's resource that we have for a COVID hotline or, our COVID website if they're able to get online. So it's going back to your traditional print media, and then again, working with your community navigators or your cultural brokers, and doing that as much as possible with social distancing, the face-to-face interaction, getting them where you can from like testing sites, right? I sat in a testing line for like 2 hours and I thought of a million ways that I could use that time to have got information to people. Sandwich boards every 100 feet, right? A big billboard about the census or just even the city's resources. So there are just so many different ways that you can reach people that's not just online.
I'm glad you mentioned that, Genesis, because that touches on another question we did get about how are you addressing the communities, and especially those who are like seniors and individuals with disabilities who are on the wrong side of the digital divide. So, Crystal or Harold, anything else to add on that?
I would just add very quickly that, making sure we're kind of connected to those that are connecting to other communities through distribution of food. That was a huge issue. I think it's a huge issue for all our cities, but consistently it's the top issue of where our pantries. So the city of Tulsa is really mobilized. Someone commented, like, we haven't been doing this all along because there was so much mobilization around distribution of food. So we use that to distribute information about the services and supports that we have, like our financial navigator program. And in terms of platforms, we use Zoom. Seems to be the best tool because you can break into small groups using that. So I'm sure everyone's learning to be a Zoom expert nowadays.
And Harold, go ahead and answer that, but if you want to. But I also wanted to go back to the cultural broker discussion we had earlier, because someone asked, how does one locate and identify a cultural broker?
I didn't catch that last piece.
I said the question was, how does one locate / identify cultural brokers?
So I think that actually does tie into the communication piece. And so the one thing I would say is use everything at your disposal and don't be afraid to try something new. You have to be entrepreneurial in that world. And again, and it ties again, you're gonna hear me, culture. So how do you identify a cultural broker? You really identify or navigator, community navigator. You have identified those through the work that you've already done in terms of, I go to the back of, if you're redoing a street or building a park or you have a water issue. It again is about being intentional in your engagement with those communities. So in terms of Longmont, we've done a lot of different things. Our police chief would do walks in neighborhoods. I would go with them. We would meet people. Our neighborhood services, they were engaging with the different neighborhood groups, and they would bring individuals in, and we would meet and develop relationships. And so there's not a recipe for identifying cultural brokers. It is, if there's a recipe, it's how do you engage with your community, engage in the neighborhoods with the community, and learn and meet the people and develop the relationships. And through those relationships, you will learn who the cultural brokers are in the community. And to the point of, I have them on my cell phone. And so we have an issue right now with some case counts. And I was able to, we were on another call on something else, and I was able to just say, hey guys, I'm gonna need your help on this because we're gonna need to dig into some different groups within our community to talk about how we handle testing and how we, try to get a handle on some case counts. And they were like, sure, we'll be there. To Genesis' point, it wasn't just because I came in there, it's because of the time we spent with those individuals prior to this. So I wish I could say there's a magic formula, but it really is spending time with your community, in your community, and really getting to know people.
Thank you all. So we only have like a minute left. So I'm going to ask you all to give your elevator pitch, just one final thought you'd like to leave our audience with today. So Patrick, I'll start with you.
Yeah, so I guess I can't stress enough the importance of starting the resilience journey with a robust assessment. Identifying not just what the vulnerabilities are, but what are some of those assets that you can then leverage in addressing those vulnerabilities. And in your assessment, make sure that, and we've talked about this throughout the last hour, make sure that the assessment team is inclusive. That includes both internal stakeholders to your organization, so the various departments, but also external stakeholders, and getting creative with those external stakeholders, whether it's private sector, the nonprofit sector, academia, those that have a voice and have a say in how the community operates and the lifelines of the community. So make sure that you've got that robust group of stakeholders to really perform an accurate assessment before developing your own resilience strategy and plan.
Thanks, Patrick. Crystal, really quick, last final thought.
Yeah, I would just say, again, participatory community engagement. So that means involving community members from the very beginning as much as possible. And I'm talking ideation, even setting up the goals.
Excellent. Genesis, final quick thought.
Yes, center your practice on equity and inclusion, and you won't go wrong. And if you don't know what that means, there are a lot of resources out there. Reach out to our cities. You've heard us talk about a lot about equity and inclusion. And then also want to put a plug for the Resilient Cities Network. Go to our website. We are a city-led network across the globe who are resilience practitioners. So resilientcitiesnetwork.org.
Excellent. Harold, final quick thought. From mute.
Resiliency needs to be a cultural attribute that has entrepreneurial thinking associated with it. And it needs to be dedicated to serving our public. And more importantly, it needs to come from bottom up. It can't come from top down. And that's what I would say.
Well, I love that. So Harold, Genesis, Patrick, and Crystal, thank you for a great conversation. We've reached the end of this panel discussion, but don't go anywhere, audience. I'd now like to introduce two special guests from Amazon Web Services, Executive Government Advisor Shantae Eldridge and Leader of Digital Government Chuck Grindall for a session presented by our underwriter, Amazon Web Services. Shantae and Chuck, take it away.
Alicia, thank you for the lead in, and at AWS we appreciate being the sponsor. Our customers are seeing benefit in shifting away and building resiliency by moving away from their legacy IT infrastructure and investing in a modern, well-architected, secure, cloud-based system which offers more flexibility, capacity based on need, generally substantial cost savings, and speed, which is essential to transform organizations to respond rapidly for unexpected changes that obviously we talked about here a little bit. For example, many states are struggling with the volume of applications for unemployment insurance, causing legacy back office systems to crash, as we have seen during this pandemic. To cite an example, West Virginia is a place where cloud infrastructure helped enable activities, including routing of calls, call queuing, interactive voice response capability, all which addressed post-COVID-19 demand at their Department of Workforce due to the rising unemployment insurance claims in February of 2020. The U.S. Census Bureau laid out the labor statistics reported for West Virginia unemployment at 4.9% around March. In just a month and a half later, that had swelled to 6.1%. And by the second week of April, that state's unemployment call center had received over 77,000 calls, overwhelming the legacy call center platform. Therefore, to build resiliency, AWS has simplified it into 5 focus pillars. And at this point, Shantae Eldridge will discuss those pillars with you.
Absolutely. Make sure everybody can hear me. It's always fun when you're doing these. So we do have 5 pillars, and we're going to go through them really quickly because I know we're short in time. So if you have a cell phone or you can do a screenshot, definitely take a picture. Because what these pillars are doing, and thank you to all the panelists because you really set up a great framework for how we can lead into this. Resiliency means a lot of things to a lot of different people and a lot of different agencies. And you not only have the internal government operations, but you also have, as we talk with Genesis and the other panelists, what's happening in the community. And so what we've actually been able to do is create a framework that can be unique to the customer, can be unique to the city or the state, and it really organizes it in a way where you can look at outcomes, analytics, business continuity, systems modernization, workforce enablement, and constituent engagement. And if you look within those pillars, there's different things that you can do to make sure that you are not only setting up your agencies and your government to be able to operate in an emergency, but you're able to operate just more efficiently downstream. We've heard a lot about how we're engaging with the community and the digital divide. And Chuck and I both came from years of being in government. Chuck was the former CIA of the Commonwealth of Kentucky. I was the Deputy Chief of Operations of the largest independent city in the nation. And the digital divide is real, and if we are actually promoting technology that is not making sure that everybody has equal access, then we're really not progressing, right? We're in a sense regressing. And so making sure that your constituent engagement, your call centers, that you can reach people of different languages, that you can have sometimes for constituent engagement, that everybody wants to have their, I know sometimes I get frustrated when you call into a call center and I'm like, where's that button where I can get to the person? I need a live person, and so you still want to be able to have that type of engagement. Real-time analytics, I believe Genesis brought up about data. You can't do anything unless you have the data to make sure that you're actually doing what you need to do. How can you make those real-time decisions if you don't know where your problems exist? And then again, we go across workforce and process and business continuity. Again, making sure that all your departments, and I believe Harold, you brought this up, all your departments are working seamlessly together, and that there is a way that it is a systematic way of doing things, and that one department isn't just doing something that is going to affect negatively of another department. And before we get to the questions to ask yourself to start your business continuity plan in resiliency, Chuck, is there anything else that you wanted to follow up?
No, Shantae, I think if you look at that, the elements that you've laid out, and when we look at security of that infrastructure from the get-go, and you all on the call know this, that as we delve our toe into these things that are constituent related, security is going to be their number one top of mind thing because of their data. And so as we innovate, we also have to make sure that we're considering security, and that is always top of mind. So making sure that you put folks at ease as you're doing these innovative things helps along the way as you're building your plan.
Wonderful. And the last part, we're just going to go through just 5 questions to ask ourselves. So Chuck and I spend a lot of time working with government leaders, such as the panelists that we have, and they're like, okay, resiliency is great. We know we got to do it. We know during the pandemic we didn't do so well. We want to do better. Where do we start? And so these are just, again, get your cell phones out, take a picture of the screen. These are just 5 simple questions to at least identify where to start. And the first one is, during COVID-19, a lot of governments thought they were doing pretty well until March of 2020, and they weren't prepared to send their entire workforce home in a matter of hours, days, So, Chuck has a former military background, and we talked about the after action review, and where could we have done better? Where do we not meet those constituents' needs that actually maybe fell through the cracks? Where could we have done better? So one, make sure that you're identifying all those risks and how you can actually mitigate them so you don't have the same, repeat of a situation. Do our employees have this proper resources to work remotely? We also talked about, again, going back to that community, how if everybody used to have to come downtown or to the State House to do their business, well, now we have to be constituents that aren't able to come downtown, regardless, could be their health or, we're back to being locked down and so forth and so on. So do our employees have the resources to provide the services that they depend on to either eat and live? I believe, Harold, you brought this up about infrastructure. Again, it goes back to security. Now that we are working remotely, now that we are doing more things online, do we have the right infrastructure to make sure that we can get that data that we need and actually be able to analyze the data quickly to make data-driven decisions? This was definitely seen when it came around to public health, with contact tracing and things of that nature. If people could not actually access where to go get tested or the results of their test or who they may have came in contact with that may have been, had COVID-19, then you're actually asking for a higher public health concern. Coming from government, do we have the right contracts and procurement mechanisms in place? Well laid out plan is great, but if you don't have the funding or the mechanisms to purchase those goods or to interact with your public, your private entities, then your plan cannot be executed. So again, do you have the right contracts and things in place where, again, I know coming from an East Coast city, we had plans in place about purchasing coal. We haven't purchased coal in decades, so we need to go and re-look at those. A lot of cities and states didn't have law for digital signatures, so again, that has to be done. And finally, this goes back to that digital divide question. do we have the correct systems in place, allow end-to-end digital services for communication for everybody across your enterprise? And if you don't, then that is definitely something you can look at. So again, these are just 5 quick questions that you ask yourself about how to get started. And now I'm going to throw it back to the moderator.
Thanks, Shantae and Chuck, for providing those insights and helping illustrate so many of the themes we've discussed today. With that, we've reached the end of our time, and I want to thank all of our speakers once again, and thank you, our audience, for joining us. And of course, a huge thanks to AWS for making this conversation possible. As a reminder, this digital event has been recorded and will be available on demand on the event website. You'll also be receiving the recording via email, and we encourage you to pass it along to your colleagues. As always, we thank you for joining us today, and we hope you stay healthy and safe. See you next time.
Thanks, Elise.